lied falsely against his brother, then shall ye do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. That's the Old Testament law. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But it's really not commanded. But that's what the people lived. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I really like what I'm not Muhammad, but Gandhi says about it. Mahatma Gandhi said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth makes the whole world blind. Gandhi. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth makes the whole world blind. But notice that the Old Testament does not require command revenge or retaliation, but has sought to curb that unlimited private revenge. Even prior to Jesus, there were attempts on the part of Jewish and non-Jewish groups alike to oppose revenge. And now Jesus comes along and he makes this very difficult statements. When he says, you've heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other. If anyone takes your coat, give them their cloak as well. If a person requires you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. You've heard that it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In the scripture reading this morning, Jesus gives us 5 different things to look at. 5 different things, of which 3 of them do not seem to match up with the other 2. But those 3 that don't seem to match up with the other 2 is when somebody strikes you on the face, when somebody sues you in court, and when somebody requires you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. When somebody sues you in court, if they ask for your coat, give them their cloak as well. You see, what happens is the coat was the outer garment. The cloak is the inner garment. And if you follow that literally, you know what happens? You wind up standing in that courtroom naked. You know, that's what goes on if you follow it literally. And what is Jesus saying? Jesus is saying, we go the 2nd mile. But you notice these first 3, you know, they talk about doing things that when we are victimized by the power of others. When we are victimized by the power of others, when somebody strikes out at us, when somebody tries to sue us, when somebody requires us to do something, we are being victimized by somebody that has power over us. Then notice what Jesus does. He talks about loving our enemies. He talks about give to those who beg from us. It's almost as if Jesus is now saying, we are the ones in power. But in these last 2, Jesus says, now you have the power. The power is in your court. You have the power to forgive. You have the power to forgive. You have the power to give. What is Jesus saying? I think what Jesus is saying is, we have rights. We have rights. But that even though we have rights, we do what Jesus asks us to do. We live in a world of retaliation and revenge. We live in a world of retaliation and revenge. And a disciple of Jesus is to live outside that world. Culture says you live in it. Culture says you retaliate. Culture says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, even yet today. Our law in this country says a person is innocent until proven guilty, but we all know that's not true. first moment a person's name hits the news, we assume that they're guilty. Oh, we give lip service to the law. We assume that they're guilty. This is one of the toughest ones to preach, folks, because we're all in this boat. And yet the disciple of Jesus goes the second mile. The disciple of Jesus turns the other cheek. And notice what it says. You have heard it said, love your enemies, love your neighbors and hate your enemies. Nowhere in the Scripture, nowhere in the Old Testament, nowhere in the Jewish law does it say hate your enemies. Jesus is turning the prism on this one. It says hate the evildoers or hate the evil one. It doesn't say hate your enemies. But it also says, you've heard that it says love your neighbor. In the Old Testament law, you know who your neighbor was? The person in the Jewish community. The person who thought like you and worshiped like you. Maybe that's why. That's why that Jewish lawyer had trouble with Jesus when Jesus told him to go and love his neighbor, and he wanted to know who is my neighbor, because with his own blinders on as a person that wanted to follow the Jewish law, his neighbor was somebody who worshiped like him. His neighbor was somebody of the same Jewish community. His neighbor was somebody who acted like him. Whose neighbor was someone who had the same customs that he did. And now Jesus begins to tell this parable of a Jewish fellow that had been laid out along the roadside, and who comes along but the detestable, the hateable, the enemy, the Samaritan. And then when the Samaritan picks up the Jew and takes him off into that Holiday Inn Express and takes care of him, and then Jesus asks, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Who is your neighbor in this situation? The Jewish fella is come straight up against his own religiosity and his own nationalism and everything that he had ever learned in his own religion. He wants to say, my neighbor is that Jewish fellow laying there in the gutter. My neighbor is the Jewish fellow that's been beat up and left. But no, he says, the neighbor is the one who did the merciful thing. He couldn't even say Samaritan, because he hated him so much. So he said the neighbor is the one who did the merciful thing. And then notice what the Scripture says also. Notice what it says when it says, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. You hear that? Love those, pray for those, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. There's no justification by faith in this passage, folks. For years, the church has talked about, Christianity has talked about justification by faith. We get that from the Apostle Paul. There's no justification by faith in Jesus. If you're going to do this, you pray for your enemies. You do good to those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. It's Paul that talks about justification by faith, and we're so grateful that he does. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus says, you want to be children of your Father in heaven? You want to be my disciple? You do what I ask you to do. You pray for your enemies. You pray for those who persecute you. You do not retaliate. And you do good to everybody person you meet. In the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.